All right, everyone. So today we're going through the fight for independence, which is the exciting part of this whole revolution thing. If you were excited with the Boston Massacre and the Tea Party, there's more violence and bloodshed here, and this is where really America becomes the United States. So let's jump in. Early on in this war, things are not going great, and a lot of this conflict is played out in the Northeast, places like New York, places like Massachusetts. Um, that's where a lot of these battles are taking place. Now, we will talk about some battles that happen in the South, but one thing to kind of really hit home here is a lot of the colonists don't know that there's like a war going on. If you lived, for example, in Stanley County, North Carolina, during the American Revolutionary War, you might not know what's going on up there in places like Boston, places like Newark and Brooklyn, and all those kinds of places. You may not even heard of some of these places. And keep in mind, word travels really slow back then. So if you did hear about these kinds of places, it might have been several weeks after the actual events. So we're going to talk about some of the battles here. I don't tend to focus a lot on some of like the nitty gritty of the battles, but it is important to know some of the battles and their significances, such as which one's the turning point, which one's a big American victory, those kinds of things. Things that America likes to focus on with this is that Britain is basically the global superpower of the world at this point in time. Now, when you start analyzing this conflict a little bit more, it doesn't seem like maybe such an underdog victory for the United States, considering that although Britain is the global superpower and has a giant navy, these battles are taking place on land. And so while Britain would be able to wipe the floor with the colonists if it was a naval battle, as Britain did with the Spanish in back in the 1500s or 1600s, excuse me, this is a land battle. And so what Britain has to do is put soldiers on ships and send them over the Atlantic Ocean to fight in a land that they're unfamiliar with. So I'll kind of mention this again when we get closer to the Vietnam War, but there's some pretty big parallels here between those two. The colonists are fighting on home field advantage, and the British soldiers are largely not. There is not a lot of tough training for the American colonists at first, but they're using more what we would say guerrilla tactics, where the British are fighting in the traditional style of warfare at this time, which is lining up in rows, firing a volley of very inaccurate musket shots, and then having a second row behind them fire their volley while the other front line reloads. The Americans are popping out of, or the American colonists are popping out of trees, hiding in bushes, those kinds of things. And again, we like to think that the Americans are fighting smarter, not harder necessarily. But the British are looking down on this and saying, this is not how you fight wars. And so anyway, I try and inject a healthy amount of British perspective into this because in reading a lot of the history from the British side, this is not a very popular war in Britain. A lot of British people are saying we're spending a lot of money that we earned in tax money to fight colonists that we don't really hate or care about or anything. And this is basically just a vanity project of King George III. And so a lot of the British people support American independence because they see that there are American colonists that want to be free, and they're supportive of that. So I've kind of talked about that a little bit in class already, but just wanted to really reiterate that. Okay. First, I guess key battle here. We could start talking about when do key battles start, but keep in mind this is the date here is July and into August of 1776. So this would have been right after the Declaration of Independence. It is worth pointing out that the King of England did not likely see the Declaration of Independence while this battle was being fought. And this is also a not so great moment for the start of the war for the Americans. This is Washington's first major battle, and it's kind of spun as a victory, even though it is definitely a defeat. You can see here the British Army takes New York City, which is one of the major cities in the colonies at this point in time. And Washington and his army are narrowly escape being defeated. This little postage stamp kind of tells a slightly different story, or maybe it tells the same story with a slightly different twist. Washington saves his army at Brooklyn, and it makes it look like a triumphant moment. But the British are feeling pretty good about this at this point in time. Our next battle here gives us a really awesome picture. I hate to say it, that's kind of the most significant aspect of this. It's not. It's a big moral boost for the American troops. But this is where Washington kind of takes control and becomes this kind of really successful general. So he crosses the Delaware River into New Jersey on Christmas night. So there's a bunch of Hessians, which this is a term for people from a region of Germany, and they are hired by the British to come over and fight the American colonists. Anytime you're talking about mercenaries, there's kind of a huge risk here because these are guys that are being paid to fight, and if payment slows down, then they're less likely to fight. If you study anything about the Roman Empire, you'll see that the Roman Empire had a lot of mercenaries under their pay. And once the Roman government stops paying them, they turn against the Romans and start fighting in Rome. And there's not necessarily the same thing going on here, but the Hessians are not British, and they're not as passionate about this war as the British are. The British are fighting for pride. These guys are fighting for a paycheck. But they are basically celebrating Christmas, and they're around a campfire, and these German dudes are, having their beer, having their drink. And Washington rolls up on them, complete surprise, and captures 918 soldiers, almost 1,000 Hessian soldiers. So this is a huge victory, and a lot of American colonists and a lot of troops say this is really a great moment from Washington. Now, there is a slight moral question here of is it an ethical play to attack people on a holiday? Being that the United States is a byproduct of this successful battle, a lot of Americans might have a hard time answering that question objectively. But if you were to maybe recontextualize it into 2023 America, if let's say there was some kind of terrorist attack on Christmas Day, that would be kind of moral outrage. People would say, this is a day where people are celebrating and being together and sharing in, a religious holiday, and maybe that's not the time to do this kind of stuff. But in any case, I just wanted to throw that out there and maybe get you to consider if Washington is doing something ethical here. Probably a lot of you would think that this is a war and ethics are kind of out the window. And that's something that we're going to revisit once we get to different conflicts and different wars. We'll talk about that in the Civil War. We'll talk about that in World War II, of course, as well. All right. Our next key battle here is the Battle of Saratoga. Notice here that our time has progressed. We've gone from July 1776 to December 1776. Now we're in October 1777. One interesting thing about how wars used to be fought is typically the fighting would happen in the summer or the warmer months, because soldiers really did not want to die from frostbite if you're going to have to try and fight the enemy and potentially take a bullet, right? It doesn't make a lot of sense to have a war go on during extreme weather. So another unconventional part of the Battle of Trenton that we talked about on this last slide is it is actually a conflict that takes place in the winter. And that is another reason why it's a huge surprise. And I mentioned the 100 Years' War back in Unit 1, Section 1 between the British and the French. That war largely went on for 100 years because fighting was really only for about 5 to 6 months in the warmer parts of the year. And then they basically hit timeout and then resumed the following spring. So the war didn't exactly last 100 years, start to finish. But of course, it was 116 anyway. But this key battle here, Saratoga, this is what convinces the French to help us out. Another reminder with the 100 Years' War is that the English and the French hate each other. And so the French here are kind of like playing the game of, do we help the colonists here, or do we just kind of wait and see how things happen? The French had kind of an ambition to see how things were going to go, to maybe enter back into North America. The French fur trading business made the French a lot of money, and they lost that after the French and Indian War, the 7 Years' War. So the French are kind of keeping a close eye on this. And after Saratoga, they decide, we're going to help America out. We're going to help these colonists become free from Britain. the French, I would like to say, are doing that out of the goodness of their hearts. They're really doing it because they want to see Britain lose a huge chunk of land that France also just lost. So it's a little bit of politics, a little bit of goodwill, if you want to kind of maybe see the brighter side of this. Valley Forge is another moment where Washington really makes a case for a great leader. He has his troops in camps in the winter in Valley Forge, Pennsylvania. You can see on the slide here 20% die from basically the exposure to the elements and lack of food. But Washington's leadership to convince those that do not die to keep fighting is praised, and the soldiers gain his respect. And they keep fighting through this. So the difficulty that Washington is kind of highlighting as well is the problems of having a weak central government. With the colonies at this time, there is really no president. There's really no one financing the war super well. And so Washington is kind of like fighting this war on scraps and quarters that he finds in the couch. Now, I'm going to highlight this because when we get after the war, there's going to be some discussions of what kind of government do the colonists create? Do they want a strong central government and have maybe someone like a king in power? Or do they want all of the states to have individual powers that mean that the states are more like their independent countries? And so this is going to highlight one of those questions that we're going to get to in a little bit in this unit. Again, Saratoga, the French kind of say, yes, we're willing to help you, America. And one of the big guys that's involved with that is the Marquis de Lafayette. Now, this guy comes over. He leads American troops in battle. He's able to help train them. He kind of looks around and he's like, what's going on here? These guys don't know how to fight. Same thing with this guy, Friedrich von Steuben. Now, Friedrich von Steuben is Prussian, and that is another area of Germany today. So it's kind of confusing maybe to have Hessians fighting for the British on one side, and then Prussians fighting for Team America on the other side. But, a reminder of this is that Native Americans in the French and Indian War weren't unified in their support of the French. The Iroquois picked Team Britain in that conflict. So regionally, you can't paint with such a big brush that like this group of people from this region all think the same way. And Friedrich von Steuben is going to come over here and really train the American troops into being more elite soldiers and less of just guys who know how to hunt deer and stuff. And that's Friedrich von Steuben. So this is definitely not an image from the time period, but you can kind of see there's this is almost to me like one of those like action movie like training montages where like the main character is like doing push-ups to get ready for the big fight and stuff. That's what I always think of when I see this picture. Friedrich von Steuben is like training these guys into being better soldiers. Key battle here. This is one in the South. So this is again where like there's some intrigue and some kind of question marks around the South's role in this whole thing. There were a lot of loyalists in the South. And the big reason for that is because of the support of slavery and how the English government basically helped those slave owners keep their wealth going. General Cornwallis is going to become like the more superior British general at this time. And I'm highlighting his name because we're going to hear about him as well in a little bit here. But the British take Charleston, and they're hoping that the loyalists in the South are able to pick up arms and really help them out. But that doesn't necessarily work. And so while on paper this is a British victory, the way the British win, they actually lose a lot of support from the colonists in the South. And so there's a lot of people in the South that are saying, well, look, we liked Britain, but they burned my house down, so I don't think I can support them now. And so it's going to weaken the British long term, even though in the short term, they say it's a win. Couple other battles here. The Battle of Kings Mountain. This is the other side of Charlotte, so it's a little bit more regional to North Carolina. The Battle of Cowpens and the Battle of Guilford Courthouse. So Cowpens is in South Carolina and Guilford Courthouse is right about near Greensboro, North Carolina. So some key battles here in the South. And again, the big question mark here is, are the loyalists from the South, those that are supporting Britain, are they actually going to help Britain out? Or are they just kind of really more, we're sitting on the fence and seeing how the wind blows here? This all leads to Cornwallis and the British moving north to Virginia, and that is where he is going to meet his fate, and he is going to meet General Washington. And this is Washington really kind of dunking on the British here because Cornwallis gets completely surrounded. It's a surprise. There's a peninsula that he gets basically isolated on, and Washington forces him to surrender. And that is the last major battle of this war. So I know it seems like I went over it quickly, but if you look at our timeline here, we go from July 1776 to our last major battle here is in October 81. So that's 5 years. That's not as quick as I made it sound. 5 years is basically longer than your entire high school career. But the war is over essentially here. Now, we're not going to sign the treaty until 1783. And that's, again, just because paperwork takes a long time in America today. But back then, it was going across the Atlantic Ocean, and you got to get people on the boats, and you got to get people to certain cities, and they have to travel by horse and buggy, and it just takes a long time to get the paperwork all drawn up. So there is going to be a Treaty of Paris. You might say that sounds familiar, and you're right. That's also the same name of the treaty from 1763, which ends the French and Indian War. So something that you will get kind of confused on is Treaty of Paris of 1763, Treaty of Paris of 1783. One ends the French and Indian War, one ends the American Revolutionary War. I wish there was an easier way for you to remember which one is which, but think of maybe the proclamation line of 1763. If you have that date kind of already in your brain rattling around, that proclamation line comes after the Treaty of Paris of 1763. Okay. For some other groups of people during this war, we can kind of imagine what it was like for maybe men who were soldiers, right? We talked about Valley Forge, starvation, and all that kind of stuff. This is a tough time for women and children as well. Although they're not necessarily facing the fight on the front lines, getting shot, women are basically in charge of not only their regular duties at home, which in this time period would have been cooking, cleaning, raising children, but they're also taking care of the farm or taking care of the business as best as they can. There are examples of women who dress up as men in this conflict and fight. And we're going to see that pretty much here. War of 1812. We're also going to see it during the Civil War. Women pretending to be men to fight to end slavery. And so you're going to see that in all those wars. It's a little harder to get away with it in World War I and World War II, but we are going to see women try and actively fill the role of combat roles. Inflation is a big problem in this time period. And if that term is something you've heard recently, we'll talk more about inflation, but essentially the money that people have doesn't buy as much as it used to. So maybe people would go to their merchant, their guy down the street, and buy an apple for $1, or at this time they'd be using pounds. With wartime inflation, that apple just went up to 10 pounds or $10. Now, that doesn't mean the apple improves in value. It means that the currency, the pound or the dollar, actually is weaker. And so that's what inflation is. Now, the difficulty with inflation is, when prices go up, if your wages don't increase, then you're paying more for the same thing you did 3 weeks ago, 2 months ago, whatever. So that's how inflation really hurts people. African Americans are also going to have kind of a conflicted time with this. So many African Americans fight for the Patriot cause. You might remember Crispus Attucks was the first person killed in the Boston Massacre. In many ways, you could say he's the first person killed in the American Revolutionary War, although the Boston Massacre was in 1770, which is about 6 years before we see any fighting here. And there are some, especially in the South, that join the British cause. The British kind of do this sneaky lie where they're like, oh, if you fight for us, we'll free you if you're slaves. And so a lot of African Americans are like, well, that sounds like a deal, because I don't think the colonists are going to do that. And when the British lose, the African Americans who are slaves are like, well, we picked the wrong side, and now we're going to remain enslaved. Even though America is fighting for freedom, it's not freedom for everyone. And that's kind of a key and unfortunate point here. Many of the people who we are talking about, George Washington included, are slave owners. And so while they're fighting for freedom from Britain, they're not fighting for freedom for every group of people or all people. An estimated 100,000 African Americans escaped, died, or were killed in the American Revolution. And that number is pretty large when you consider the number of deaths in this war and the number of people living in the colonies at this time. Many slave owners were, saw their slaves walk off the plantation to fight for the British, and they executed them, or they tried to capture them, and then when they did, they killed them. So as I mentioned already, the Treaty of Paris of 1783 ends this war. It confirms the U.S. independence, and America becomes this global symbol of democracy, equality, and freedom. Now, that says democracy, equality, freedom to the world. That all of those should have air quotes and asterisks around them, because democracy, yes, but once America starts, it's really only white landowning men who are able to vote. Equality, as my previous statement suggests, people were not treated equally. And then you have a whole class system of wealthy people in power, poor people not in power, let alone talking about marginalized groups like women, African Americans, and certainly children as well. And then freedom. Again, we are a country where most of the states at this time do not outlaw slavery. So freedom from Britain, freedom from oppression, freedom from taxation without representation, yes. Freedom for everyone, no. This little chart here that you're going to complete, I will pass this out in class, but basically this is just a way to keep track of which battles happened when. And so I'm not going to go through any more on this, because you just have to go through the slides backwards and to kind of fill this in. You're going to start here with the Battle of Brooklyn. So there's 1, 2, 3, 4. We'll throw Valley Forge on there. 5, Charleston. 6, you can kind of lump all these in together. 7, Yorktown, and that is it.